When a pharmaceutical plant loses its regulatory memory, people don't just lose money, they lose lives. I was finishing my second cup of coffee in the small break room at the end of Building C, the one with the window that looked out over the loading docks, watching a refrigerated truck back in from Route 9. 6:15 in the morning. I'd been here since 5:30. Not because anyone asked me to. Because the quarterly EPA submission window opened at 6, and I liked to be ahead of it by 90 minutes. That's just how I worked. That's how I'd always worked. My name is Robert Harlan. I spent 22 years as the Director of Environmental and Regulatory Affairs at Meridian BioFormulations, a mid-sized pharmaceutical manufacturer outside of Trenton, New Jersey. We made generic injectables, saline-based compounds, anticoagulants, a handful of oncology support drugs. Nothing glamorous, but the kind of product that ends up in an IV bag in a hospital room somewhere, which means the margin for error is exactly zero. I knew every filing we'd ever submitted to the FDA, every 483 observation we'd ever received, every CAPA response, every deviation log, every environmental permit tied to our wastewater discharge. I knew which inspectors preferred printed binders and which ones wanted everything on a shared drive. I knew that our Building A HVAC validation from 2011 had a footnote discrepancy that we'd corrected but never formally closed in the master document index. And I knew exactly where that correction lived and why it didn't affect our compliance status. I knew these things because I'd built the system from scratch. I'd lived inside it for more than 2 decades. I also knew, that particular Tuesday morning in October, that I had about 3 weeks left in this building. The letter had come the previous Friday, formal, clean, thanking me for my service, citing organizational restructuring and a strategic shift toward centralized compliance management. 2 weeks notice, 4 weeks severance. A handshake from our new chief operations officer, a man named Garrett Foss, who had been with the company for 11 months and who had never worked a day in pharmaceutical manufacturing before taking this role. Garrett had come from a logistics consulting firm. He was sharp, well-dressed, and completely fluent in the language of cost reduction. He talked about redundant overhead, streamlined vendor partnerships, and scalable compliance infrastructure. What that meant, in practice, was that he'd negotiated a contract with a third-party regulatory consulting group based in Chicago, a firm that would handle all of our FDA and EPA submissions remotely for about 60% of what my department cost annually. The math looked good on a slide deck. It always does. What Garrett didn't know, and what I had tried, twice, to explain in meetings he'd cut short, was that our regulatory posture wasn't just paperwork. It was institutional memory. It was knowing that the EPA had flagged our stormwater drainage in 2017, and that we'd resolved it through an informal agreement that existed in a letter, not in the official permit file. It was knowing that our FDA establishment registration had a legacy address discrepancy from a 2009 facility expansion that had been verbally acknowledged by our district office, but never formally corrected. It was knowing that our process validation master plan referenced a piece of equipment, a granulator in Building B, that had been decommissioned and replaced, but whose documentation chain I had personally maintained in a shadow file because our QA team had never properly retired it in the system. None of that lived in a software platform. None of it was in a binder someone in Chicago could open and read. It lived in my head, and in a filing system I had built over 2 decades that looked, to anyone who didn't know it, like organized chaos. I tried to say this. Garrett nodded the way people nod when they've already decided and just need the meeting to end. His son-in-law, a 29-year-old named Tyler, who had recently been brought in as a strategic operations associate, sat next to him in every meeting with a laptop open, typing things that I was fairly certain had nothing to do with what was being discussed. Tyler had once referred to my department as the permit guys. He'd said it cheerfully, like it was a compliment. So I finished my coffee, submitted the quarterly EPA report, and started packing my files. I want to be clear about something. I did not leave anything incomplete. I documented everything I could document. I spent my last 3 weeks writing a transition guide that ran to over 200 pages. I flagged the legacy discrepancies. I outlined the informal EPA agreement and scanned the original letter. I noted the granulator documentation issue with a bright red tab and a written explanation of exactly what the risk was and exactly how to resolve it. I handed all of it to Garrett's assistant in a labeled box on my last day. I shook Garrett's hand. I said goodbye to the people I'd worked with. I stopped by the QA lab and said goodbye to Elena, who had been my counterpart for 14 years and he looked at me with the expression of someone watching a structural beam get pulled from the building. I told her to call me if she needed anything. She said she would. Her eyes said she was worried. Then I drove home. My wife had made dinner. My son, who was finishing his last year at Penn State, called that evening and asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. He asked what I was going to do next. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but I had some consulting interest from a few former colleagues, and that I wasn't in a hurry. He asked if I was upset about the way it happened. I thought about it for a moment. About Garrett and his slide decks. About Tyler calling us the permit guys. About the 200-page transition document sitting in a box that I was fairly certain no one had opened. I told my son that sometimes the best thing you can do is make sure your work is sound and then let things take their natural course. He said that sounded like something from a fortune cookie. I laughed and told him to finish his thesis. I took on some consulting work. A small biotech in Pennsylvania needed help preparing for a pre-approval inspection. A specialty chemical company in Delaware had received a notice of violation from the state environmental agency and needed someone to navigate the response. I worked from a desk in my study, made my own hours, and charged more per day than I'd made per week at Meridian. There's a certain irony in that which I didn't spend much time dwelling on. About 4 months after I left, my former colleague Elena called me. She didn't call about the regulatory files. She called to tell me that Meridian had entered into preliminary negotiations for a major supply contract with a European pharmaceutical group, a German conglomerate called Hartmann Welde AG, one of the largest generic drug distributors on the continent. The deal would make Meridian a primary U.S. supplier for 3 of Hartmann Welde's core product lines. The contract value, based on a 5-year term, was estimated somewhere north of $200 million. Elena said the executive team was treating it like a company-defining moment. Garrett had apparently been the one to cultivate the relationship at an industry conference, and he was being talked about internally as the person who had saved the company's growth trajectory. She also said that Hartmann Welde had sent over a due diligence checklist, and that their regulatory compliance review team was arriving in 6 weeks. There was a pause on the line. I asked her how the transition to the Chicago consulting group had gone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, that there had been some difficulties with the handover, that some of the files hadn't transferred cleanly into the new document management system, that the consulting group had asked several questions she couldn't answer. I asked about the granulator documentation. Another pause. She said she wasn't sure where that file was. I told her I hoped it turned up. I meant it. Whatever had happened between me and Garrett Foss, my name was attached to 22 years of work inside that facility. I didn't want to see the plant fail. I didn't want to see the people I'd worked with lose their jobs. And I certainly didn't want anything to happen that could affect product quality or patient safety. But I also knew what I knew. And what I knew was that a German regulatory due diligence team, operating under EU pharmaceutical standards, was going to come into that facility and start asking questions that required answers that were not in any software system in Chicago. 6 weeks later, I was at my desk reviewing a draft response document for my Delaware client when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I answered anyway. It was Garrett Foss. He started with small talk, which told me everything. Garrett was not a small talk person. He was efficient, direct, and transactional. If he was leading with pleasantries, it meant he needed something and wasn't sure how to ask for it. I let him talk. He said he was reaching out because the company was in the middle of an exciting partnership opportunity he didn't name Hartmann Welde, I noticed, and that as part of the process, they'd had some questions come up around legacy documentation. He said the transition to the new compliance platform had surfaced some gaps in the historical record. He said he wanted to know if I might be available for some short-term consulting engagement to help close those gaps before a scheduled audit. He said it the way someone says they have a small leak, when what they mean is that the basement is flooding. I asked him what kind of gaps we were talking about. He said he'd rather discuss the specifics in person. I said I was happy to come in, and that I would have my consulting rate agreement sent over before the meeting. He paused. Then he said that sounded fine. I showed up at Meridian the following Tuesday. I had a visitor badge, which was strange after 22 years of walking past the security desk with a wave. The receptionist, a new person I didn't recognize, called up to Garrett's office to confirm I was expected. The conference room was the same one where Garrett had handed me my restructuring letter 4 months earlier. He was there, with Tyler beside him, laptop open as always. There was also a woman I didn't know, introduced as the lead contact from the Chicago consulting firm, and Elena, who caught my eye across the table and gave me a look I couldn't entirely read. Garrett walked me through it methodically, which I respected. He was not someone who obscured problems when they were unavoidable. The Hartmann-Velde due diligence team was arriving in 9 days. They had already sent a preliminary document request list. The Chicago consulting group had been working through it and had identified 17 line items they could not fulfill from existing files in the system. 4 of those were categorized as high priority by the German team's own audit protocol. He slid a printed list across the table. I looked at it. The first item was the Stormwater Drainage EPA informal agreement from 2017. The second was the establishment registration address discrepancy. The third was the granulator decommissioning documentation chain. The fourth was a set of stability study, raw data files from 2014 that supported our current product specifications, files that had been stored on a legacy server that had been migrated during the platform transition, and that, according to the IT notes in the margin of Garrett's printout, had not transferred completely. I looked at the list for a long moment. Then I looked at Garrett. He had the expression of a man who understood exactly what the situation was and had no good options. To his credit, he didn't pretend otherwise. Tyler, beside him, was looking at his laptop. I asked if anyone had opened the transition document I'd left in the box on my last day. The woman from Chicago looked at Garrett. Elena looked at the table. Garrett said that the document had been reviewed during onboarding, but that given the volume of materials, some items may not have been fully actioned. I said I understood. I told him that 3 of the 4 high-priority items were recoverable. I knew where the EPA letter was. I knew the exact paragraph in the FDA's 2009 district correspondence that addressed the registration discrepancy, and I knew the protocol for submitting a formal correction that would clean it up before the audit. The granulator documentation chain was in my transition guide, with a precise description of where the shadow file lived in the building's physical archive. Room 114B, 3rd cabinet, 2nd drawer, labeled with a red tab. He asked about the stability study data. I told him that was the one I was less certain about. The raw data files had been on a server I didn't control, but I knew the original study director, who had since moved to a consulting role in Maryland, and I believed he might have retained a working copy. I said I could make a call. Garrett asked me what I would need to come back in and resolve this before the audit. I told him I'd send over an engagement letter that evening. He nodded. I looked at Tyler, who was still looking at his laptop. I asked, not unkindly, what he was working on. He looked up. He said he was taking notes. I said that was good. I spent the next 8 days working inside Meridian as a contracted consultant. I located the EPA letter. I drafted and submitted the establishment registration correction through the FDA's electronic gateway, using the exact procedural pathway I'd mapped in 2019 when I'd first identified the discrepancy and decided to document the solution in advance. I walked the Chicago team's lead contact to room 114B personally and showed her the granulator file. I made the call to the former study director in Maryland, who did in fact have a backup of the stability data on an external drive he'd kept after leaving the company, and who was willing to certify the files and provide them through proper documentation channels. I did not rush. I did not perform. I just worked, the way I had always worked, methodically and without drama. On the 7th day, Hartmann-Velde's due diligence team arrived. They were 4 people, 2 regulatory specialists, 1 quality systems auditor, and a senior compliance director named Dr. Werner Braun, who had the demeanor of a man who had seen every version of every problem and was not easily impressed. The audit took 2 days. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Dr. Braun requested a meeting with Garrett and asked, directly, who had compiled the remediation package for the 4 flagged items. Garrett looked at me across the conference table. He said my name. Dr. Braun turned to me and said, in precise, formal English, that the documentation package was among the most complete and well-organized remediation submissions his team had reviewed in their current audit cycle. He said that the establishment registration correction, in particular, had been handled with an understanding of FDA procedural nuance that his team rarely encountered at facilities of this size. He said he had one question. He asked why my name appeared throughout the historical compliance record but not on the current organizational chart. The room was quiet. I said I had recently transitioned to an independent consulting role. Dr. Braun said that was interesting. He looked at Garrett for a moment. Then, he looked back at me and said that his team would be recommending approval of the facility's compliance status to support the contract negotiation. He said, however, that Hartmann-Velde's standard contract terms for a supply partnership of this scope included a clause requiring the facility to designate a named regulatory affairs contact with a minimum of 10 years of relevant experience who would serve as the primary liaison to their compliance team for the duration of the agreement. He asked if Meridian had such a person available. Garrett said they were in the process of evaluating options. Dr. Braun said that Hartmann-Velde would need a confirmed designation within 30 days of contract execution. Then he closed his folder and said he looked forward to a successful partnership. After the Hartmann-Velde team left, I packed up the materials I'd been using and said goodbye to Elena in the hallway. She walked with me toward the lobby. She didn't say much. She just said she was glad I'd been able to come in. I told her I was glad too. Garrett caught me in the parking lot. He said he wanted to talk about the named contact requirement. He said the Chicago firm could potentially fulfill it on paper, but that their team didn't have someone with the institutional knowledge of the facility that the situation clearly required. He said they were also now reassessing the overall structure of the compliance arrangement. He paused. He said he wanted to know if I'd be interested in a longer engagement. I asked what he had in mind. He said he was thinking of a 12-month retainer, regulatory affairs oversight, available for audits and submissions, primary liaison to Hartmann-Velde. He named a figure. I told him I'd need to check my current availability, since I had other clients to consider, which was true. I had 3 active engagements and was in conversations about 2 more. The market for someone who knew what I knew was, it turned out, fairly robust. He said he understood and asked me to let him know. I drove home on Route 1 the late afternoon light, past the industrial parks and the strip malls and the warehouses that lined that stretch of highway, and I thought about the 22 years I'd spent driving that same road in the same direction. I thought about the coffee in Building C and the EPA submissions at 6 in the morning. I thought about the granulator file with the red tab in room 114B, which I had placed there myself on a Thursday afternoon in 2019, because I'd thought it might matter someday. I thought about what I'd told my son on the phone the night I left Meridian, that sometimes the best thing you can do is make sure your work is sound and then let things take their natural course. He'd said it sounded like a fortune cookie. Maybe. But I'd spent 22 years building something careful and true in that facility, and when the moment came that it was needed, it was there. Every document, every discrepancy note, every shadow file with a red tab, the work had held. I called my son that evening. He was studying for his last round of finals. He asked how the consulting job had gone. I said it had gone well. He asked if I was going to go back. I said I was thinking about it, on my terms. He laughed and said it sounded like I had some leverage. I told him the word I preferred was experience. He said fair enough. I accepted Garrett's retainer offer the following week, after negotiating the rate upward by 20% and adding a clause that gave me full authority over any external regulatory submission that carried my name. Garrett agreed without much pushback. He was not a difficult negotiator when he didn't have options. Tyler, I was told by Elena a few months later, had been moved to a different role, something involving vendor logistics. She said it without editorializing. I didn't ask for more details. The Hartmann-Velde contract was signed the following spring. The first shipment went out in June. Dr. Braun's team conducted a follow-up review in the fall and gave the facility a clean report. I got a short email from Garrett after that review. 2 sentences. It said the audit had gone well and that he appreciated my work. I replied with 1 sentence. I said I was glad the documentation was in order, which it was, because it had always been in order, because someone had spent 22 years making sure of it, in a small break room at the end of Building C, before the sun came up, drinking coffee and watching the trucks back in from Route 9. That's not a story about revenge. I want to be clear about that. It's a story about what it costs when an organization decides that the person who keeps everything running is a line item, and what happens when the bill finally comes due. The people who think about compliance as overhead have never stood in a regulatory audit and tried to explain a documentation gap to someone who has seen 1,000 documentation gaps and has no interest in your explanation. The man who knows where the bodies are buried, pardon the expression, does not need to do anything dramatic when someone makes the mistake of thinking he can be replaced by a software subscription and a phone number in Chicago. He just needs to wait, because eventually, someone is going to need to know where room 114B is. And that someone is going to call